Good morning or good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm so excited that you decided to spend 30 minutes studying some Torah with us this morning. It's like lovely to look at and see all of these people. Usually I only see one or two people in my tiny New York space where I'm at. So this morning I want to give a little bit of an introduction to what we'll be talking about, and then we will look at some texts, and I'm hoping that by the end of the 30 minutes we'll also have a little bit of time for some meaning making. We're looking today at kind of the thread of a single midrash. So we're going to be looking at one thread of interpretation based on a single verse in our parsha, and we're going to be meeting a new character that if you read just the plain text of the Bible, you might not know is part of our Jewish reception of sacred tradition. But I think she's actually quite important and also sadly underrepresented. So I'm hoping to give a little bit of representation and maybe even some imaginative voice to the character that we're going to be learning about today. So we're in Parashat Chayei Sarah. It's kind of like an ongoing rabbinic joke that's not terribly funny that we call it Chayei Sarah, the life of Sarah, but the parsha actually begins with Sarah passing away. Sarah is the wife of Abraham, who is sort of the progenitor of the Abrahamic traditions, considered the first ethical monotheist, a pretty big deal. And just to refresh us, because we're going to be talking about a lot of sort of family dynamics, we have Abraham and Sarah, who are partnered, and then also Hagar or Hajar. Hagar is both Sarah's handmaiden and also the mother of Abraham's other child, Ishmael. So there are two sons typically that people are aware of additionally in this kind of five-person family of Yitzhak and Ishmael, Isaac and Ishmael. But today we're going to be looking at a sixth member of this family who, like I said, is not in the plain text of the Torah. And really quickly, I have here a bencher. I'm repping this morning for the conservative movement with my USY youth group bencher. But if you've ever said Birkat Hamazon, chances are you have already met this character. You just may not have known it. One of the blessings that we reference when we're saying Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals that we typically do at a meal where we're eating bread, especially a Shabbat meal, is we say Bakol Mikol Kol. And it's a reference to the different amounts of blessings that the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, received from God. We say Bakol Mikol Kol, like Abraham is blessed Bakol in everything. Isaac is blessed Mikol, from everything, Kol meaning all. And Yaakov, Jacob, is blessed Kol, in everything. And so there's like kind of a shleimut, a wholeness of everything that is emphasized in that verse. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Of course, it's taking me a minute. It is not allowing me to share only my preview screen. I wonder why that is. I'm having a little bit of trouble. Thank you all for your patience while I figure this out.
And in the meantime, I'll post the source sheet in the chat box.
Thank you. Oh, I got it to work. I just had it minimized. So we're going to look at this verse. I will also say that because of our limited time together this morning, we only have 30 minutes. I will be doing most of the out loud talking. However, our Torah, what is beautiful about it in part is that it is a multivocal tradition. Our tradition, our texts speak to us in lots of different voices. So please, 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 I would really encourage you while we're going through this to put your thoughts, your observations, your questions in the chat. Please make really good use of the chat. If you put it in the chat, I will read it or try my best to read it out loud as we're going through so that I can represent more voices and more ideas, because I think we'll have a richer experience if we can pull from everybody's perspectives. So I'll open the chat to that effect. So we're looking first at this verse in Genesis 24:1. And we won't be doing a lot of the Hebrew, but for the sake of, it's the first verse we're reading, I'll read this one in the Hebrew and then in the English. V'Avraham zaken ba bayamim, v'Hashem barach et Avraham ba kol. We say, and Avraham was old, well stricken in age. I love this translation of like, it's like he's sitting in it. Ba bayamim, like he had come to the fullness of his days. And God had blessed Avraham in all things. Ba kol. So we see here this little three-letter word right here, ba kol. So the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud Bava Batra 16b takes up this idea and they go, what do you mean Abraham was blessed in everything? I just want to sit with this idea for a second. If we're at all familiar, and you can put this in the chat, with the story of Abraham, is your natural conclusion to say that Abraham was blessed in everything? This man did not live an easy life, right? He left his home. We have a lot of sort of Midrashic stories about the literal breakup he has to have with his family. His brother dies, his cousin is captured and he has to rescue him. His children are fighting all the time. Yeah, Michael Osher says, much surus. Okay, he was wealthy, so he definitely had material blessing. But it's kind of incredible that we have this super complicated figure, and the Torah says very simply, God blessed him with everything. And yet, so because of this sort of textual complication, it's a very subtle complication. It's not like it's factually incorrect, but it brings up a lot of questions. The Talmud starts to investigate it in Tractate Baba Batra. So the Gemara comments that this disagreement is parallel to a dispute between the Tanaim, the early sages who lived from about the year 0 CE to the 200s, the first sort of progenitors of the rabbinic project. The Tanaim had this fight about what Bakol means. So the Torah says, and the Lord blessed Abraham in everything, Bakol. And the sages, may their memories be for a blessing, disagree, the Talmud reports, about what the heck Bakol means here. Love people are saying in the chat. Also, yeah, we can feel free to disagree with the sages also. It's one of the great things about Judaism. We can kind of insert ourselves into the argument. Everybody has challenges, but Abraham was successful. Maybe he was blessed because he knew the fullness of life, the good and the bad. Maybe he had an overall sense of blessing despite the complications of his life. I love these ideas. Let's zoom in and see what the sages say. They go in a very particular direction. So Rabbi Meir says, the blessing is that he did not have a daughter. We love some second century misogyny. But Rabbi Meir says maybe the blessing is that he had only sons and not a daughter. I love, so he's saying, yeah, his blessing maybe was his relationship with God. So Rabbi Meir has a very particular idea about what Abraham's blessing was. And the text says, okay, Rabbi Meir, we're going to listen to you, but we're not going to give you the last word. And then they move and bring the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says, on the contrary, his blessing was that he had a daughter. He had both sons and daughters. And there are others who say, says the text, Acharim Omrim, we don't know their names, but people are insisting along, Rabbi Yehuda says Abraham did have a daughter. We just, she's not in the text. And these anonymous voices come one further and they say, Abraham had a daughter and her name was Bakol. So we're going to zoom back a little bit. Looking at first now how the rabbis are reading into this verse in the Torah, that Abraham did have a daughter. He had a third child, and her name was Bakol. So they're saying, Berachet Avraham Bakol, instead of reading, God blessed Abraham in all things, or in everything, Rabbi Yehuda and his friends are reading in, God blessed Abraham through his children, with the having of children of many genders, and lastly, through this daughter whose name was Bakol, which is not a name people have very often, even in the Torah, where people have very strange names. But we have this rabbinic tradition starting in the Talmud between the Tanaim, our very early sages, who say, there's this character. Abraham has a daughter. Isaac and Ishmael have a little sister, and her name is Bakol. So we're going to move forward to Ramban, who is a medieval Jewish scholar. And this is what he has to say about Bakol. And he kind of goes to the heart of our argument that we're having here in the chat. Not really argument, but this multiplicity that we're having in the chat of what was the blessing of everything. What might this Bakol mean? Is it always the daughter? It says, and the Torah mentions this to say that because Abraham was complete in everything, he did not lack a single thing, that he would see the children of his children inherit from his virtue and honor. So Rambam is bringing this idea, and he says, well, maybe we could read this word Bakol not as the name of a person on the surface, but maybe in the sense of what we were talking about earlier, the shleimut, of that Abraham actually gets to know his children and feels assured about the continuation of his project on this planet, not just his family, but right, he and Sarah were the first monotheists. They brought a completely new idea into the world, and this idea that his project was going to be continued by his children. He's part of, rather than being, an isolated idealist, he's actually created this new stream of thought and of spirituality that'll be continued by his family. And I think that's what Ramban, is asking us to look at. And he so yearned for this, Ramban says. And our sages said in this wonderful matter, and thusly, he says, this is wonderful. This is like, I think he's kind of in some way applauding the innovation of our spiritual tradition, that we're able to like bring out and see in this little verse this whole extra life of this character. And he says, and Hashem blessed Avraham Bakol. Rabbi Meir says that he did not have a daughter, but like we read, Rabbi Yehuda says that he did have a daughter, and Bakol was her name, say others. So what do we think about this idea? How might our envisioning of this sort of like first family of monotheism really shift? And we can put this in the chat. If we add a whole extra person into this family dynamic, what might it mean for us to think about like this character of the little sister who's watching all of the incredible and very out there contentious things that are happening in this family? I wanted to think maybe if some of us are, I'm an oldest sibling, but I talk to my little brother a lot, who's much younger than me, and he's like, it's kind of crazy to like watch you and our other sister be grown-ups, and I'm still in high school, and all of these things happen in our family all the time, and like, I'm worried about my homework. I think we can kind of, the Midrash is asking us to sort of look at the family dynamic of Avraham in the same way. I think there's something compelling to think about what it means to have this little sister watching the biblical drama of Genesis. We don't, she never speaks, but she's kind of observing all of it. But I want us to like maybe be midrashists for a minute, be inventive readers of text, and think about like what could we imagine the experience of Bakol being in this parsha. Carolyn noted that he did again marry Keturah, and it could be their child. Or maybe this is Hagar's child. Yeah, we don't know just from this midrash from Bava Batra where Bakol came from, if she's Sarah's child or Hagar's child. The rabbis have some theories we're going to see in a minute. Tanya, I love this. She probably needed therapy because her dad tried to kill her other brother, and then her other brother Ishmael got sent away. Yeah, absolutely. Wanting Abraham to sacrifice another brother. Yes, every family, what is it? Is it Tolstoy who says that every family, unhappy family, is unhappy in their own way? This is true. I think this is biblical family unhappiness of like even more increased proportions. Yeah, probably glad that Abraham didn't sacrifice girls. Maybe in some way her gender, we could think about Bakol being maybe shielded from some of this drama because she's not the focus of the like inheritance crazy. She gets left out of it. And at the same time, maybe feeling really isolated. I love thinking about like Bakol is not a matriarch. The way that like Sarah and then Rivka and Rachel and Leah are, that we have another woman in this line who's sort of hiding under the text in our tradition. She doesn't get name checked in our prayers the way that her mother and her sister-in-law and her grandnieces do. Yeah, Susan, that Bakol was a blessing to Abraham. Yeah, that's kind of the hook into her experience that we have. That this child was a blessing, this sort of like third perspective or third character. Maybe she brought a sense of shleimut. We could imagine Bakol the peacemaker. When Avraham dies later on at the end of this parsha, we read that Isaac and Ishmael reunite in the city of Beersheba to bury their father together. And I think it's compelling to imagine Bakol maybe negotiating between the two. I'm sure we've all been in the position in our families of being like the person who gets on the phone and is like, okay, I know you guys don't talk, but do you think you could be in the same room? And it would mean a lot to Grandma if we could all be here and make this work for 6 hours. Maybe she's a negotiator. Maybe she married an Amalekite. Yeah, perhaps. Oh, Jay, I love this, that maybe Bakol is a metaphor for all of us as like thinking of ourselves as the children of Avraham. Yeah, I find that especially compelling, actually, as a person who converted to Judaism. My Hebrew name is Bat Avraham Vasera. Oh, I really thank you, Jay. That's like an incredible Torah that speaks to my identity very deeply. Maybe that is why I like Bakol so much as a Bat Avraham. So Bakol, there are some more theories about her life and where they came from. Tanya also, yes, the idea that she could be on talk shows. Yeah, Bachel would spill a lot. I would watch Real Housewives of Beersheba where Bachel either gets to host or is like the last person who comes out behind the curtain. That would be incredible. That would be a Yehudim Bayim sketch if anybody watches that show. So I want to see what else our sages and our tradition has to say. I think what's interesting is that Bachol, where most Midrashic characters get really developed still in sort of the ancient era before the year 500 or even 800 BCE, or CE, excuse me. So like most of the time, if we have a character in the Midrash, where we get all the juicy details comes from the Midrash itself. It's recorded in books like Genesis Rabbah, which is like big Genesis, expanded Genesis, kind of where we hold the Midrashic tradition about these characters in Breshit, in Genesis. But instead, Bachel has this very late blooming in our tradition. Her story isn't so much picked up in the Midrash. It's like she's mentioned in the Talmud, but the thread, we see Ramban talking about her in the Middle Ages, but the thread really gets pulled much, much later, starting to be in the late Middle Ages, going into the Renaissance, and even the Hasidic tradition is really the people who pick up the mantle of Bachel. So we're going to see sort of where they go with this and what tools they use, really unique tools, to expand upon her story. So we have, this is the opening piece of the Parsha, the opening verse. So we're going back, we've gone down a track right from the Bible to then the Talmud, and then these late medieval commentators. We're like going back in time in our source sheet back into the text itself, into Genesis 23, the previous chapter, where it says, and Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, the same as Hebron, saying, okay, if you think of Hebron, Kiryat Arba, same place, different names, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and weep for her. So this is the verse where we get, where the sages link the commandment to eulogize, is actually here in this verse. If you look at this little last piece, Lispod L'Sarah, we often call a eulogy at a Jewish funeral like giving a chesped or giving chesped, and it comes from this verb, lispod, to sort of expound upon a person's life, to make meaning, to share in their life, to let other people know sort of what this neshama in our lives was all about, who this person was. So the rabbis read that he's not only mourning for Sarah, but he delivered the first Jewish eulogy for Sarah, Abraham did, when she was buried. And he wept over her. V'liv kotach. It has that fabulous aspirated hey at the end, so that you know he's weeping, not generally, but specifically over her, over Sarah. Liv kotach. And our sages do something, actually our later teachers as well, do something to this verse in the Torah. It's a little right here, Liv kotach, but we're going to look at it inside the Torah scroll in a minute here as well, to see there's something particular about the way that this verse is written on the physical cloth of the Torah inside the scroll that gives us kind of new tools for investigating Bachel's story. So this is from Sefer Ziknei Machane Yehuda, the elders of Machane Yehuda. Most of us think of Machane Yehuda, if we're familiar with it, as the location of the Shuk in Jerusalem, but it's also the name of a certain book. But this is on a larger commentary on our Parashat Chayei Sarah. And Abraham went to bury Sarah and cried for her. So they're just quoting and paraphrasing a little bit our text from the Torah, from our Parsha. And the Chaf, the letter Kaf, looks like this, kind of a backward C sometimes, is small in the actual text. And it was cited, says the Ziknei Machane Yehuda, it was cited by Rabbi Shalom Shachana of Lublin, which I believe is in Poland, that Abraham also had a daughter who was called Bachol, who died in the same chapter. And furthermore, this tiny kaf remains within the words Belivita and his daughter. That is to say, Abraham went to bury both his wife and his daughter. So Bachol actually may not have, she may have lived a full life, but the way that the Parsha tells her story, we actually hear about her after she's already passed away. And that we're not hearing about Bachol, Berech Babakol verse comes in chapter 24, but there may be a hinting that she passes away in chapter 23. She's like lived her whole life in reverse order of the Torah's telling. Oh, I'm seeing in the chat too. Yes, that there was a beautiful chesped, if you haven't had the chance to watch, it's online, by the recently deceased Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, may his memory be for a blessing, who just passed away, who was really a gadol in our own era, one of the great Torah scholars, I think also one of the great democratizers of Jewish learning, wrote in a way where so much of our tradition was presented as very fluent and available to us, in so many of his writings. Absolutely, yeah, that chesped, it's a beautiful example of like the chesped par excellence, what it means to give chesped at someone's funeral. So I want us to look, this is a picture of the way in which this verse and this word is written on the Torah scroll. And we're very lucky to have Julie with us this morning, who is a soferet. So Julie, if you have like any extra information about this, I would really, really love to hear about it. But we can look, all of the letters are generally pretty uniform in size. But it's my understanding when you write a Torah scroll, you have to preserve sort of all of the like textual variations. If something's like got kind of a funky crown, we have to preserve the funky crown. If a letter is bigger or smaller or spaced a certain way, we keep it there universally on all Torah scrolls. I feel like I'm telling you, Julie, like stuff that you're such an expert in. I'm a little intimidated. But we can look here. Here is the tiny chaf, or a tiny kaf in the letter. It's smaller than the rest. And so there's a way to read this as the bacha of, or bechi, the crying, to cry for her. But what the Ziknei Machne Yehuda is saying is we can also read it midrashically, interpretively, without the chaf here. And instead becomes livitcha, of, instead of for her daughter, of using the word bat tav. That he's not just coming to eulogize Sarah and weep for Sarah, but that he came to eulogize Sarah and weep for Sarah's daughter, meaning Bakol. And so from these two tiny verses from Genesis 24 and this story and the opening of our Parsha, we have actually a whole entire life and like a very nuanced and complex life that the sages are reading into these two verses, that we have this daughter of Abraham who is a blessing to her family, who may have died at the same time as her mother and is buried with her mother, and is mourned alongside her mother. But we have this entire universe of a human being and of a character, like held in, even like in one little chaf, that we can either read in or read out, whether it's crying and mourning for Sarah or crying and mourning for Sarah's daughter. So I'd love to hear in our last 5 minutes in the chat sort of like how this is landing for folks. Did you know about Bakol? What might it mean to sort of have an additional presence in this story in the background as we read this story in Genesis, particularly a female presence? Our tradition is a beautiful one, and like all human traditions, it is not immune, I think, from the suppression or erasure of women's voices. And it can be, at least for myself, Asher, really impactful to see literally just under the letters, not even like, oh, metaphorically we think about like textual suppression, but literally inside the ink on the Torah scroll, we see reference to this woman and to her whole life. Lev means heart. Yeah, we could also read it instead of le batcha or le bitra, levita, we could read it as, yes, like, I don't know how you would, if you broke up the word differently, if you read the lamed as, instead of like a construct of towards lev. But I think, yeah, maybe there's also potential for really deep exegesis, deep midrash here. Should also note, I've gotten a question or two in the chat about my headwear. This is just a headband with a really poofy knot on the top, but I wear a headband instead of a kippah as a practice of kishui rosh, of remembering there's something above me all the time, like I would with a kippah, but in a little bit more of a feminine way. which I think is in some ways is kind of the project also of how I want to read this parsha. What does it mean to read back in a gentle way, more space for a fuller experience? I think Tanya put in the chat, yeah, if the patriarchs had other children besides the one who got the lead role. Yeah, I think it might be, with our last few minutes, a really important thing to imagine. Also, of ultimately, like when we organize ourselves in Jewish community, we're a community of individuals, and I think it often feels like each one of us is the main character of our own story. But I think it's so essential to remember all of the people who the spotlight is not on. Yes, and Abraham had more children with Keturah, absolutely. We learn about that after Sarah dies, he meets Keturah, who some of the Midrash says might actually be Hagar. She just changes her name and comes back, and she and Abraham reunite. But this is a child who's not explicitly mentioned in the Torah text. In some ways they're so sidelined that it takes thousands of years of tradition to resurrect and bring out the narrative of Bachol, and yet I think that there's something really compelling about the spiritual work that it asks us to do, to turn our attention to the people who might feel like a fly on the wall, or to turn our attention both in our textual reading and in our communities and our lives to the people who might have otherwise gone unnoticed. I think that can be sort of the power of Bachol, and that she's kind of a reminder that even the people who may not be the most well-known or the most interesting or the ones we want to spend a lot of time talking about, they're not just there, but they're a blessing. They're really necessary and needed, and are part of what creates this idea of, like, for us to show up Bachol in the fullness of our community, in the fullness of our lives. We need not just the people with the spotlight on them, but we need the whole ensemble to have a sense of shleimut and of fullness. And that, I think, would be my bracha as we end this time together, is that we take a little time this Shabbos to either, if we feel like maybe the person who is on the edges, to spend some time giving ourselves like some real spotlight and kavod and attention this Shabbos, or maybe if we're in our communities, whether they're in person or on Zoom, to give some attention and some recognition and some kavod to the people who might be more quiet or more on the edges, that they are also a part of our blessing.